Failed states. The dramatic reasons behind nations' collapse. In the current global economic climate, many people, both on YouTube and in the real world, want to know first and foremost what is wrong because they want to know what is not working. But there are also reasons to be optimistic. The world's total production is significantly higher than it was before the pandemic that began at the end of 2019. And this year, or potentially last year, it is predicted that the world will surpass $100 trillion in GDP for the first time. This means that the world is producing 3 times more goods than it did just 23 years ago, at the beginning of the new millennium. Meanwhile, we have added 2 billion people to the planet, with an increase of about 30%. Much of this prosperity is not distributed equally, and as the world becomes richer, it also becomes more unequal. If you appreciate the video you watch and want to help us continue creating interesting content, we kindly ask you to consider the idea of subscribing to our channel and leaving us a donation to support us. Thanks to your support, we will be able to continue improving and offering you new insights. You can do it here below, through the appropriate buttons, subscribe, and thanks. When economists are not talking about the latest crisis, most people tend to agree that this trend will continue. Today, while the global economy as a whole is stronger than ever, a trend is emerging in which an increasing number of individual economies are experiencing isolated collapses, threatening the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people, especially in developing countries. Already this year, not even halfway through, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan are almost completely collapsing. It is important to understand why this is happening now, as opposed to a couple of years ago, when the global economy could have been in much worse condition. Why are so many economies at risk of economic collapse? These economic failures have a problem in common. They are all in the same place. Finally, economists can simply avoid these problems to avoid ruining other economies. The reason why most national economic failures tend to occur in developing economies rather than in developed or developing ones is that developed economies have many advantages over developing ones, while underdeveloped economies are always in a state of economic collapse. In underdeveloped countries, such as Mali and South Sudan, economic production is largely informal, and people live in a much less market-dependent way than many other populations in the world. In these countries, especially in rural areas, people often live on less than $2 a day, but they do not need money as a formal means of exchange and are able to survive because they grow and harvest much of their own food, build their own shelters, and provide reciprocal services within small communities. The macroeconomic data of these countries often shows a worse situation than the reality, as the goods that people produce for themselves are not counted in national economic production, and if they are almost impossible to record. In developed countries and advanced economies, most of people's work is employed to produce goods for the market rather than for themselves. This is a positive aspect overall, as people can specialize in certain jobs and produce more for everyone. But it also means that people become more dependent on the market and cannot produce everything they need for themselves, as in less developed economies. Of course, this does not mean that life is easier and richer in these countries, but even a 20% decrease in recorded economic production in a year does not affect the quality of life of the average person in that economy to the extent that it does in economies where most of people's work is employed to produce value for the market, thus obtaining almost everything they need. This means that the quality of life of the average person in that economy is not affected as much as in economies where most of people's work is dedicated to producing value for the market, thus obtaining almost everything they need. At the opposite extreme, developed economies have a number of advantages that make total collapse very rare. Developed economies often have industries that provide goods and services of value to the rest of the world, so they have a stable and reliable source of external income. In addition, the high standard of living of developed countries makes them an attractive destination for skilled workers from around the world, who can fill skill shortages almost on demand. If developed economies need engineers, they just need to release a few thousand work visas for engineers, and the role will be filled fairly quickly by those attracted by the high salaries and standard of living of developed economies. In fact, if the labor market slows down and there are fewer workers, unemployed engineers will be forced to return to their countries of origin, creating a problem of unemployment for developing countries. Developed countries can also borrow money at low interest rates and from their own citizens, who are on average wealthier. Some developed countries can borrow funds in their own currency and do not have to face the problem of exchange rates or of obtaining foreign currency to repay loans. There have been several economic collapses that have begun when developing countries have been temporarily cut off from the source of US dollars, due to a slowdown in trade or simply because US-based financial institutions have withdrawn funds from the national economy. This is because interest rates have risen and the economic future of many weakened countries has become more uncertain. Why should large multinationals risk investing their money in a developing country that could be the next Sri Lanka, when they could simply invest their money in government bonds that offer high returns without risk? This also puts pressure on developing countries, as governments must set even higher interest rates on government bonds to compensate investors for the risk of not investing their money in government bonds whose repayment is practically guaranteed. Currently, Sri Lanka is paying an interest rate of 24.4% on its 10-year government bonds, but even this is not enough for most investors. This undermines the role of government in economic growth, which is really important. One of the most important roles of government is to provide the infrastructure necessary for industry to function. This includes ports, airports, roads, telephone and internet networks, education, and healthcare. No industry would be able to operate competitively without such services. Companies like Amazon use ports and roads to transport their products around the world, and of course, the internet infrastructure to manage the entire business, and they need educated people to build all of this. Investing in infrastructure for the existence of an industry is crucial for any economy. Eventually, many of these services can be privatized, for better or for worse, but initially, the role of government is to build them. Good spending on infrastructure should allow for sufficient economic growth and ensure that the additional tax revenue generated by industrial activity is returned to the government in the form of taxes. This allows governments to repay the loans taken out for the development of the infrastructure. Unfortunately, in the real world, most governments cannot simply print their own money to finance these projects. This is because the projects usually involve large international companies, which do not accept payments in the currency of a developing country that has not yet created any value. They want a global reserve currency, such as the US dollar, the euro, or, if it is a Chinese construction company overseeing the development, the Chinese yuan. In any case, developed countries have a significant advantage over developing countries. Of course, reinvestments, expansions, and maintenance are always necessary, but it is still much easier, cheaper, and less risky than building public structures from scratch and expecting that industrial activity will be stimulated enough to repay the loans. Another advantage of developed countries is that they can borrow funds at low interest rates. For a country like the United States, it is difficult but feasible to invest in projects that stimulate economic growth or that of other countries. In the case of Sri Lanka, however, it is unlikely that national development projects will contribute annually to overall economic activity for 24.4% of their cost. This also assumes that the investments are made successfully in projects that promote national economic activity, rather than to satisfy the ego of obtuse dictatorships at home or abroad. In the last decade, one of the largest sources of foreign investment in developing countries has been China's New Silk Road initiative. The Chinese government has turned to underdeveloped and developing countries, mainly offering low-cost loans for the construction of infrastructure projects that would open up the trade networks they were trying to build in the region. Many countries were willing to join this scheme, as the development of infrastructure is the first step towards economic development. The trick was that China would require the repayment of the loans, even at a low interest rate, and that it would control what was built. Since China was a strong supporter of the infrastructure that would make trade with China more profitable, the countries involved were more likely to end up with seaports, even if an electrical grid was a better economic investment than a seaport. Today, China has effectively halted this lending program and has become a global debt collector, seeking to recover funds from countries that are clearly struggling to repay even China's fairly generous lending conditions. From a global macroeconomic perspective, China has moved from being a net provider of capital to a net recipient, forcing developing countries around the world to find sufficient funds to repay the loans. It is impossible for a single country to control the global economic situation. It cannot dictate China's foreign policy or the decisions of the central bank on interest rates, but it can carefully choose which projects to carry out and which to reject. Fortunately, economists Douglas North and Robert Fogel have received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1993 for solving precisely this problem. Today, almost all the developed countries in the world have well-functioning democracies of one kind or another. The only exceptions are the less developed and oil-rich countries. North and Fogel were economic historians and studied the consequences of revolutions in Europe. These revolutions were those that abandoned or limited the power of the monarch in favor of a representative government. In a democracy where the people can decide on policy through the vote, every decision must be in line with the will of the people, and a wrong decision increases the probability of losing the next elections. The leaders of the government are therefore motivated to offer their services, not only to align the citizens but also to provide them with the tools necessary to increase industry and give opportunities to a greater number of potential voters. The major economic decisions made in developed countries today require a long time to consult voters on the details of their plans. This is because every project or infrastructure seems to take a lifetime to be implemented, while a country like China can build an entire city in a month. The slowness of the process is a compromise to please as many people as possible, but it has the advantage that practically all entrepreneurs have control over the government's double work. Most citizens ignore most of what the government does, but if things are done badly or if there are externalities that affect them directly, they have the necessary influence to ensure that they are not done. Even in the most democratic representative systems, there are cases of mismanagement, but they are usually addressed in the next elections. Most of the countries involved in the New Silk Road initiative were not strong democracies, and therefore the level of consultation and careful consideration before accepting the proposed agreements was much lower. Even within China, small ministries are able to give the go-ahead to large initiatives, so there is no shortage of projects that lead to practically nothing. The power of representative government and its ability to promote strong economic performance, as demonstrated by North and Vogel in their Nobel-winning study, have also inspired the popular book Why Nations Fail. These are the fundamental reasons why economies, especially in developing countries, are failing. But the question remains as to why they are failing precisely now. The financial institutions that lend billions of dollars to governments around the world for economic development are not stupid. Poor economic management, investment failures, and even corruption can put national economies in a position of vulnerability, slowing down economic growth, but they do not cause failure on their own because creditors do not give them enough money to repay them. Some economists argue that creditors will not give the country enough rope to hang itself. This assumes that everything remains the same, even if it involves heavy indebtedness and wrong economic decisions. Economic collapse is like a fire. There can be plenty of fuel and oxygen, but without a spark, nothing will happen. In this case, the spark is an economic shock. Economic shocks can be divided into two main categories: supply shocks and demand shocks. A supply shock is like an earthquake in an industrial area that destroys all the factories, which means a rapid and unexpected decrease in the supply of goods in that economic area, which can cause serious problems if the country has existing economic weaknesses. Demand shocks are such that the entire population is too afraid to go out and spend money because they have read the terrible news, have saved in case things go wrong, and want to stay safe. Businesses will no longer be able to sell goods and services and hire employees, resulting in increased unemployment, a shrinking economy, and existing weaknesses. Shocks can also be unexpected increases in demand and supply. This is positive in the long term, but it can put pressure on the economic system in the short term. If tomorrow the supply of housing tripled because someone invented a new way of building more houses on the same plot of land, house prices would plummet, damaging the entire economy. In the long term, an increase in the supply of housing is a good thing, but in the short term, it will cause problems. The economic shocks of the last 3 years are evident. If it takes a spark to trigger an economic collapse, the global pandemic and the economic response to it have arrived suddenly. The global economic crisis has posed a major challenge, as countries are negotiating their debts and seeking assistance from international organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank to try to contain the economic collapse before it spreads to other countries. Unfortunately, in the coming years, it is likely that many other national economic crises will occur as the world adjusts after a difficult start to a new decade. Even though many of these changes will be positive overall and the world as a whole will remain a more economically prosperous place, such growth will favor, as always, some countries more than others. Share your personal experience on today's topic with us. Write it in the comments and ask us any questions you may have. We will be happy to answer. Leave a comment so that we can perfect our creations. We will be happy with your simple like, but the most important thing is not to forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos.